Today, we feature our old friend, Ralph Blumenthal, a longtime Silurian and a reporter for the New York Times from 1964 to 2009. His only other job, apparently, and his first journalism experience was in 1963 at the Grand Prairie Daily News Texan. And I'd love to hear a little bit about that later on. Ralph ran the gamut of reporting for the Times, from the Metro desk, where everyone starts, to foreign correspondent in Europe and Vietnam, to the Southwest Bureau, to the culture desk. He shared a Pulitzer Prize as part of the team that covered the first World Trade Center bombing in 1994, one of a dozen major awards and prizes he's won over the years. Investigative reporting was his favorite pastime. He exposed Nazi criminals hiding in the US, got the first tip on Kurt Waldheim's Nazi past, and led the team that exposed the Tawana Brawley racial hoax. Several of his 7 books dealt with crime and punishment. Most recently, his bio of Sing Sing reform warden Louis Laws. He also authored a tome, The Last Days of the Sicilians, on the 1988 Pizza Connection drug case, famous in its day. And in Once Through the Heart, he tells the story of a police detective's struggle with his own daughter's drug addiction. Which brings us to Ralph's latest book, The Believer. Even while he was churning out several other books and a bunch of journalism, including his teaching stints at Exeter and Baruch College, Ralph was digging into the strange career of John Mack, a brilliant, renowned Harvard psychiatry professor who spent the last decade or so of his life exploring the world of UFOs and alien abduction. He was a believer and suffered enormous ridicule as a result. Mack also seemed to be involved in every political and scientific movement of the 60s and 70s. And so Ralph's book goes well beyond John Mack to cover, for instance, the life of T.E. Lawrence, that's Lawrence of Arabia, Mideast diplomacy, anti-nuclear activism, which John Mack was heavily involved in, Esalen, Joan Baez, yoga, self/other duality, false memories of sexual assault, and crop circles. Mack also experimented with drugs, including LSD. Ralph will tell us whether he sees any connection between that and Mack's belief in visitations from other planets. Ralph is eager to answer your questions, I'm sure, so send them through your chat function and I will convey them to him when he finishes his presentation. Ralph, take it away.
Thank you, Mike. We got to go on the road with this. This is good. I love the way you made it sound. Anyway, virtual reality is very appropriate for this gathering, alas, or thankfully. I didn't think I'd be greeting my fellow Silurians from this end of the Zoom, but I'm delighted to do it. Thank you for the invite. I thank Joe for his offer to write up my story for Silurian News, and to David Margolick en route on the Metro line up from Boston, who was witness to some of the Sturm und Drang that went into this project. So I'm going to forego a reading because everyone says those are deadly. And if you want to read, first of all, buy the book or go on to Amazon and, thumb through the inside this book and get a taste of it. So I'll kind of plunge in. It's a portrait of John Mack. It's basically a biography of John Mack, but as Mike said, it goes quite beyond that. And who was John Mack? He was an esteemed psychiatrist, professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and he became the most famous or infamous proponent of alien abduction, or let's say more neutrally, investigator of alien abduction, which continues to confound everyone today. So my book is about one of the most puzzling mysteries in the cosmos. That and life after death, actually, I think are the two biggies. So nobody really knows. And if you're reading, you want to get to the end of this book to find out the answer, you won't find it. I mean, it is a mystery, but I at least hope to illuminate some of the things that the alien phenomenon is not. It is not insanity. It is not the delusion of crowds. It is not, by and large, fabrications or hoaxes. It is something else. It's something happening in some reality that is indeed very real to the people who go through it. So I start off my book with an epigram from Sir William Crookes, who was a scientist in England in the 1870s. And he said, I never said it was possible. I only said it was true. And I think that kind of expresses the enigma of this whole field. Charles Fort was a wonderful humorous chronicler of the anomalous, and he said this whole field is like looking for a needle no one ever lost in a haystack that never was. So I take that as my starting point. So let's start with John Mack. He was a product of eminent, ancestors. Parents were professors. His father, Edward Mack, was an English professor at CCNY when I went there. And it was one of the many synchronicities of this story that I discovered. And synchronicities, as Carl Jung said, are the secret byways through the cosmos that connect us to things that have no rational connection. On his father's side, he was descended from a pioneering ophthalmologist, an early Jewish professor at Harvard at a time when Harvard had a Jewish quota, noted cancer specialist. And on his mother's side, which was even more interesting, he was descended from a family of German brewers who ended up founding Rheingold beer in America. And that every time I say that, that stupid jingle keeps going through my mind. I can't get rid of. If you're old enough to remember it, you know what I'm talking about. And I, like everyone else in my generation, voted for Miss Rheingold. Anyway, Max, growing up was very wealthy. I mean, his father grew up in the Sherry Netherlands. The family never had money problems, even through the Depression. But his mother died when he was 8.5 months old. She died of appendicitis. Penicillin had just been invented, but it wasn't in common use yet, so they couldn't save her. And the trauma of losing a mother at 8.5 months haunted Mack his entire life. And as I develop in the book, one of the reasons he set out on this quest for the ineffable. He was always searching for someone or something. His stepmother, who he got, his father remarried shortly after John's birth mother died, was prominent, certainly in her own way. She had married the great-grandson of the Gimbel's department store family. And she was a widow because he jumped out of a window during the Great Depression. So John Mack's father married her, and Mack got a stepmother who was very tough, a professor in her own right, but quite a daunting figure. So John Mack, who was charismatic and cobalt-eyed and tall and sort of a magnet to, particularly to women, devilishly handsome, grew up in this German-Jewish, rather conventional German-Jewish household that was very averse to spiritual matters. They read the Bible at home, but only as literature. It was not a religious upbringing at all. And as a matter of fact, the family was against superstition of any kind. So Mack was not a prime candidate for what would come to him as a career. He developed mental health services for the poor in downtrodden Cambridge. He went to the movies to see Lawrence of Arabia, as we all did in 1963, only he came away with a burning desire to investigate T.E. Lawrence and spent 12 years on a psychological biography of Lawrence that won the Pulitzer Prize. So that made him instantly a Middle East expert. So he went off to the Middle East to try to make peace between the Arabs and the Israelis. He met Yasser Arafat, and that story's in the book. And then he went on to become a peace activist, as Mike sort of outlined. He protested nuclear weapons in Nevada, got arrested with his family. So he was a real activist. But that still doesn't explain why he became the proponent of anomalous fields, or whatever you want to call it, later on in life. And we'll get to that. One of the key transition moments was when he went out to Esalen, that psychic think tank on the Pacific, and fell in with a guy who had developed something called holotropic breathing, a breathing discipline that facilitated altered states of consciousness, drugs without drugs. And as John Mack himself said later, that opened up my psyche, and the UFOs flew in. So I think that's quite a revealing statement. So, one thing led to another, and he got an introduction to meeting with these people who were also doing the breath work, and he sort of discovered a possible past life he had, because the breathing regressed him to early in his childhood when his mother died. So he suddenly became aware of all these spiritual aspects to life that he, even though as a psychiatrist, he was trained in the workings of the mind and psyche, he didn't realize the strange dimensions of reality, and now he was exposed to it. So he got an introduction to a man named Bud Hopkins, who's very interesting in his own right. Bud Hopkins was an artist on Cape Cod who, on his way to a party one day in the 60s, saw a UFO. And he and everyone else in the car saw it over the ocean, and they got to the party and they told the other guests, hey, we just saw a UFO. And lo and behold, all the other guests piped up, hey, we've seen UFOs. Everyone's seen UFOs. Everybody came up with a UFO story. So Bud Hopkins decided he was going to look into UFOs, and he became really the first investigator of not only UFOs actually predated him, the interest in investigation of UFOs, but the alien aspect of it. And Bud Hopkins found people who recalled or seemed to recall with very traumatic affect encounters with little, not green, they were gray, but little green guys, little gray guys who seemed to come out of these UFOs and then abduct the people for all kinds of strange medical experiments, including apparently reproductive procedures to breed a hybrid race. So he told John Mack about this. Mack at first was not only incredulous, he dismissed Bud Hopkins as a nut, but he started reading the letters that people had sent Bud Hopkins, and he thought it was something that he would investigate. Now, he was, as I said, a trained psychiatrist. He was very eminent in his field, and he quickly realized that the people who were coming to him with these stories, and he did interview them at length himself, he never quite decided whether they were patients or research subjects. It was something in between. But he decided that very clearly from his expert, professional training, they were not insane. They were also not delusional. They were not looking for publicity. On the contrary, they were afraid of attention. They only contacted him sometimes after elaborate, procedures to disguise their identity. And they were not out to perpetrate a hoax. They had no interest in that. What did that left in nothing, as far as John Mack realized, except the fact that they were telling the truth on some level, that something had happened to them that was not explainable by all the conventional, earmarks of our society. The stories they told fell into what I call in the book and what is known in the field as the core abduction narrative. People are either asleep in their beds, but not always at night. They are sometimes conscious. They're driving a car. They could be anywhere. And they see a UFO. They see something land. And then they go through a period of missing time. They lose awareness of how much time passes. and then suddenly they proceed to their destination. They realize it's 2 hours later, and they don't know where the time went. And later, in either conscious recollection or hypnotic regressions, they recall encounters with these strange beings. Now, these beings, you've seen the pictures probably, they're described rather consistently as short, kid-sized creatures with kind of rubbery, chalk-like gray skin, huge eyes, their most memorable feature, which seem to hypnotize or mesmerize humans. They communicate telepathically. In other words, words just pop into the minds of the people who encounter them, because it's often asked, well, you mean they're speaking English? Somehow they communicate their thoughts in English. The people hear the thoughts in their mind. And then commonly, the people, according to this scenario, these people are transported, beamed through walls, closed windows, onto some kind of a craft that's described as sort of clammy air, very little furniture, possible computer screens in the distance, no sign of kitchens, bathrooms, not what you'd imagine a conventional aircraft to look like. And where they're put on a table and put through all kinds of strange medical experiments, including, as I said, the harvesting of eggs from women and sperm from men for production of a hybrid race, because people who told these stories said that later they were re-abducted and introduced to their offspring, half human, half alien. So this is completely wild stuff, as John Mack realized. But he added a special dimension that people like Bud Hopkins didn't pursue. And John Mack found that the people who had these experiences often came away transformed. They had a better appreciation of the earth, preserving the planet, connecting with a source or deity, and being much more spiritual. So there was a positive aspect that he found to this, which made his take on it kind of special. Bud Hopkins and another researcher named David Jacobs, who joined their research, took a rather different view, that the aliens were much more traumatic and evil, and that people were basically just traumatized. They didn't get anything positive out of it. So Mack studied dozens of these so-called experiencers, and after his efforts to publish his research were rebuffed, he tried to put them in an article, but it was much too long, and it was, you can see from my presentation, much too complicated to reduce to an ordinary peer-reviewable article in a respected journal. He decided to go the public route and published first one book and then another. And they were both huge sellers. First was called Abduction, and it was 13 case studies of these people who he gave pseudonyms to so as not to expose them. But their actual identities came out in many cases. He met, by the way, with the Dalai Lama, and I have the transcripts of their discussions with a group of other UFO researchers. Dalai Lama was very interested in the spiritual aspects of this. And so Mack wrote this book, which of course put him in bad odor with his Harvard colleagues for many reasons, one of which was jealousy. They found him writing a best-selling book, and that is a no-no in academia. He also attended a conference at MIT, which is the way I opened the book, because MIT, of all places, played host to a 1992 conference of experts on the abduction phenomenon. People of many scientific disciplines were perplexed, and they gathered theologians and atomic scientists, psychologists, psychiatrists, folklorists, to examine this phenomenon from every possible aspect. So there was some history of taking this very seriously and trying to figure out what was going on. But Harvard was scandalized, as you might imagine. Mack was too enthusiastic about the whole, field investigation he was pursuing, which he acknowledged later. It looked like he was validating his experiences instead of just assessing them. And Mack said repeatedly he ruled out every other possible explanation except that this had really happened on some level, which he couldn't explain. But Harvard was quite negative, to say the least. It convened what I call an inquisition, a committee to look into his methodology, his finances, and put him really through the ringer. More than a year of investigation. They read all his material. They interviewed experiencers themselves, and it was a clash of worldviews. As Mack himself said, he saw things a certain way. The committee at Harvard said basically, and it was headed by a very eminent professor who was the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, Arnold Relman, who recently died. And the take of the committee members was that if you can't, see it, feel it, touch it, taste it, it ain't there. It doesn't exist. And Mack was trying to explain to them, well, certain things, can't be quantified or can't be proven, and yet they're real and they deserve to be studied. Anyway, Mack, after he went through a terrible process, financially cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars of defense. He had two wonderful lawyers. One was Danny Sheehan, who had been the lawyer for the Karen Silkwood family after she was mysteriously killed, meeting David Burnham of the Times, by the way, after she tried to expose plutonium accidents at her atomic plant and nuclear plant in Oklahoma. He had represented her. He had investigated the Ku Klux Klan. He had investigated the Iran-Contra arms deal in the Reagan administration. So he was a real firebrand. And then his partner was Eric McLeish, who had previously exposed the priest abuse scandal in Boston. So Mack had eminent legal representation, and they gave Harvard a hard time. And in the end, by the way, Harvard never issued a report on the investigation. They ended up exonerating Mack, essentially telling him he should just be a little less enthusiastic, which he agreed. But I, through Mack's papers and legal memoranda from the lawyers, et cetera, I put together the story of the investigation, but Harvard never issued a report on it. And by the way, coming to Mack's defense through all this was Alan Dershowitz, who wrote a piece defending Mack's freedom of academic conscience. So Mack, after that, went on to expand his interest in anomalies. He went from alien abduction to, he realized he was treating it perhaps too much of a singular thing, and expanded his research to related fields, as Mike suggested, to crop circles and the Holy Grail myth, or whatever you want to call it, Bigfoot, cattle mutilations, all kinds of other things that were anomalous that we don't understand. And Mack's research went far and wide. Irish fairy tales and the old hag syndrome I spent some time talking about, where people, particularly in Canada and Newfoundland, recorded episodes of being in bed and feeling an evil presence climb on their chest and try to strangle them. And the professor who wrote a book about it himself encountered this syndrome. So these were all things that kind of fit into Mack's world of anomalies that he found later were somehow related. They were all part of a bigger picture. And at the very end of his life, Mack embarked on a study of afterlife experiences, and he was pursuing a book about a young woman with paranormal gifts, a very brilliant young psychiatrist who died of, she was studying brain cancer, and she died of the same brain cancer she was studying. And after she died, friends and family said she sent signals from the beyond, and Mack was very interested in that story. So, which brings us to his death. Mack was almost 75 when he was invited back to London to lecture on Lawrence Symposium. He was still the expert, and he climbed out of the underground station one night, looked the wrong way, and was run over by a drunk driver and died. Immediately, there was speculation that he'd been assassinated, that this was not a normal accident. But I got the police reports, I checked it out very carefully, and I debunked that story that there was any skullduggery involved in his death, strange as it was. And in some ways, as I say in the book, Mack seemed to be ready or welcomed his own death, because he was telling people, maybe I can do better work from the other side. And sure enough, in final chapters, I talk and I say, this is not part of my regular research. It's not, I don't give it the same credibility I give the rest of the book. But there were people who reported seeing him or his spirit after he died and encountering him. So kind of full circle. So how I came to write the book, as Mike again said, and as I said in my Silurian news piece, it was not my usual fare. I mean, I've been writing about the mafia and Nazi war criminals and crooked cops and crooked politicians. And so how did I end up with aliens? Well, as I also said in the article, we all know as authors and writers that very often we don't choose our subjects, our books choose us. And that's part of the mystical aspect, I guess, I kind of connected with in this whole project. And I did gain a wider understanding of an unseen world, and I'll talk about that later if you want. But what happened was I was the Southwest correspondent for the Times in Houston in 2004. And I picked up a used book one day, and it was John Mack's second book, Passport to the Cosmos. I knew nothing about John Mack. I thought it sounded interesting. I read it. It was actually a tamer version of his first book, which was more sensational. And he learned in the meantime to tone down some of his approaches, and it was much more scholarly and more thoughtful and a better book, as he himself said, the second book, which I read. So I thought, this is really interesting, a Harvard psychiatrist who writes about aliens. I got to talk to this guy. So I made a note to give him a call, track him down. I had no idea how famous he already was. I was very naive. But Mack was hugely famous. He had gone on Oprah to promote his first book. He had, as I said, he'd won the Pulitzer Prize. He was a legend at Harvard. He was infamous for the Inquisition he'd been put through. And Bill Honan, actually, of our culture desk, had written him up when he was under investigation. So I had missed all that. I didn't know who he was, but I thought he'd be interesting. So I was going to give him a call. And then I picked up the paper a few days afterwards and found he'd been run over and killed. So I did call the family and say, I'm very interested in his story and I'd like to learn more. And it was terrible timing because they were involved in deep grieving. They didn't want to hear from me. But I did follow up and spoke to them again. And eventually they agreed that they would share his archive with me. And very happily for any biographer, I got access to all his records, his private journals, even his analysis tapes. He went through analysis like all psychiatrists have to do, and being a meticulous researcher, recorded them, and they were in his archive, and I got access to them. So I heard what he told his own guru. He had an Indian guru, so that was a wonderful insight into his life. And among the things he talked about a lot was his interest in other women. He had love affairs which were devastating to his wife, who stood by him. wonderful woman who I interviewed before her own death. And anyway, it was great material for a biographer. And it took me 16 years to sort this stuff out and to get it down. And the book was officially published this week. So I know some of your questions will probably deal with what did I think of Mack and how did I come out on this, so I can anticipate that quickly, very quickly, by saying I tried to keep my judgments out of the main part of the book because I wanted readers to encounter John Mack as I encountered him. I wanted it not to be I wanted not to put a heavy thumb on the scale and urge readers to think one way or another about this material. I found you need to have a lot of respect for this subject because it's very complicated, and the initial reaction, this is crazy stuff, it can't be happening. Of course it can't be happening, but these people are still coming in with these stories. So I did not want to prejudice readers with my take on it, but at the end, if this is a spoiler alert, I do find that Mack was a kind of a hero who ventured forth and had, according to Joseph Campbell's classic structure, had many adventures, tried to resist the call to adventure, and yet was pulled towards it, suffered all kinds of trials and agonies, and yet emerged with a boon for mankind, which is the record of his research. So I do call him a hero at the end of the book, and I say what he did is what heroes do, and even more importantly, perhaps, it's what human beings do, because I find great sympathy for our poor species, which is outranked by the aliens on so many grounds. They have better vehicles than we do. They do stuff we can't do, if you believe all that stuff. And human beings are victimized. They're subject to all these experiments, et cetera, in the stories. And yet we are the ones doing the investigation and trying to figure out what it all means. So yay for us human beings. Anyway, that's the story as quickly as I can summarize it. I really appreciate your interest and the opportunity to talk to you, and certainly welcome your questions.
You tease us in your story for the Silurian News saying, do you want to know how I really feel about this, read the book. But in fact, I read the book, and at the end, you say what you just said, which is you're neutral on the subject. In your epilogue, you write, in another reality, if there is such a thing, was there ever a time when you said, wow, this is all nonsense and it isn't worth all of my energy here, and I'll go on to another project? Were you off and on in this?
Well, I was off and on because I didn't spend 16 years, every day on it. I went through periods where I put it aside and had to do some other things. But I never felt like giving it up because I was hooked by it, just like John Mack was. I mean, once you get into this subject, and what I have to say is that people who are so-called skeptics or debunkers really need to read the material. It's very easy to laugh at it and to say it's not possible. Of course it's not possible. But on the shelf behind me somewhere is a book called Alien Discussions. It's a transcript of the MIT conference. It's 500 pages of papers on this whole phenomenon by the experts. So you have to look into it. And once I started looking into it and getting into it, I couldn't let it go. I mean, I was intrigued. I didn't think I'd find an answer or the answer, but as I say, at least I know what it isn't. And it's not the things that people, quickly toss off. Oh, they're crazy. It's insanity. It's delusion. It's sleep apnea. That's a common one. Oh, but a lot of these things don't happen during sleep. They happen in waking moments. And it's not ideas implanted by hypnosis, because some of it is in conscious memory, not hypnosis. So anyway, all the things you think it could be, it isn't. So what is it? Well, we don't know. But that's what hooked me.
Subject to a lot of skepticism and even ridicule. Have you been the target of any of that sort of thing?
Well, when, quite separate from this book, in 2017, Leslie Kane and Helene Cooper in the Washington Bureau and I collaborated on the first piece about the secret Pentagon effort to track UFOs.
Right.
And as I said, it has really nothing to do with the book. We just happened to find out about this guy who was the head of this secret Pentagon program, who resigned because he wasn't getting enough government support. So we were subject to jokes. Helene Cooper said that every time she went through the Washington Bureau, people would start going, no, 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 making noises. So there's a ridicule factor to this. There is, and that's what stops a lot of people from going into it.
Some extremely prominent people are believers. You mentioned Dalai Lama. Lawrence Rockefeller. Tell us about Lawrence Rockefeller.
Yeah, Mack not only had one billionaire supporting, he had two billionaires supporting him. He had Lawrence Rockefeller, who gave him a lot of money, and he had Robert Bigelow, the guy I wrote up in the Times recently for funding this Afterlife essay contest of proof of the afterlife. Bigelow is a prominent NASA contractor who has a module attached to the International Space Station. And Bigelow, who's really quite shy and doesn't, talk much, did bankroll Mack too, and a famous poll to try to see how many people had these experiences. So, but Lawrence Rockefeller was a very prominent supporter of Mack, and Lawrence was involved in a lot of anomalous causes. Apart from his conservation efforts, he saved St. John and the Virgin Islands and all that, but a very brave guy who, actually there's a little story I can tell quickly in the book where Lawrence had invited some prominent alien abduction specialists and Bill and Hillary Clinton to his ranch in Wyoming. And at one point, Lawrence Rockefeller got Bill Clinton aside and said, "Bill, could you look into the government files on UFOs and say what's going on?" And afterwards, Hillary got Lawrence Rockefeller aside and said, "Lawrence, don't ever bring up that subject again." And Lawrence Rockefeller said, "If there wasn't anything to it, why would she say that?" So I thought that was very funny.
Did Mack believe in psychics? Do you believe in psychics? Did you ever try to reach Mack through a psychic? I mean,
I never did. And by the way, just for the record, I have not been abducted that I can recall. I have not seen a UFO that I can recall. So, and neither did Mack. He always said he was pure when he did his research. He was not, flogging some experience that he himself had had. He came to it as an outsider. So no, I didn't try to contact Mack. But you know what? I must say that in the course of writing this book, I would get ideas at night, which I came to think of as downloads, things that would pop into my mind, maybe, very rationally because I was thinking about it, but maybe not rationally if you're more spiritually inclined to think that somebody was sending me signals to make sure you say this or look into this. And that happened quite frequently. Ideas would pop into my mind. I'm not saying that John Mack was sending me these messages, but he did appear, as I say at the end of the book, to certain people. And one woman said she had a dream that she knew Mack, she encountered him after he had died. And he said, "Come on, let's go to the restaurant." So she goes to a restaurant with him, and he sits next to her on the banquette, and he's wearing a short sleeve shirt, and she notices his arm is really hot. And she says, "John, you're burning me." And he says, "I know, that's so you'll know I'm real." So that's just one of the stories. She said to him, "You're dead." And he says, "Yeah, I know." Anyway, I don't know if that answers your question.
Well, Suzanne Charlet asks whether he was into ESP at all.
Well, he was very open to anomalous communications. I mean, he he came to believe in the stories people told of telepathy, because, as I said, that's the way these aliens supposedly communicated with people. So he didn't find that strange. He was very open to that. He did say, he said many times that there was an unseen world that we don't understand, that we can never prove, because it's inimicable to prove. And this is what came up repeatedly during the Harvard Inquisition. They kept saying to him, well, can you prove, this? You say people got implants from aliens. Do you have an implant? No, I don't have an implant. Well, can you prove any? No, I can't prove it. So well, it doesn't exist. He said, well, I can't prove it, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Anyway, they went back and forth. But so he was open to a lot of things. And I would say, yes, he certainly would believe in ESP.
For the book, interview some of the so-called experiencers?
I did, and the stories are in my book, because not only do I recount Mack's investigation of these experiences, but I got to know them myself. And in the Vanity Fair piece I did, which was kind of a report in progress on the book, I went to a gathering in Newport by a woman who has an inn there. She just had to sell it, unfortunately, because of COVID and the economy. But every year, experiencers would spend a week at her retreat with scientists and people like Mack when he was alive, and Bud Hopkins, and they would discuss these things. So I went after Mack's death, and I met some of these experiences. I talked to them, and I found them, as Mack did, which is really crucial, absolutely normal in every respect, except they had this extraordinary experience which no one could explain. But nothing differentiates them from ordinary people, and that's what makes the thing so puzzling. If you could, pigeonhole them and say, well, only people who are, like this have these experiences, but there seemed no common denominator. It seemed really across the board, and yet there were so many people have not had these experiences. Yeah. So. Some smart researchers have suggested it's as important to investigate the non-experiencers as it is to investigate the experiences. Why have some people not had these experiences? And why, don't some experiences why do some things not fit the general core narrative? So there's a lot of questions.
Let me read a little bit from your Silurian News piece. A snowmobiler named Kathy had been dumbfounded to discover her missing outer garments neatly piled beside her. A woman called Jill found herself back in bed, tucked in so hard I couldn't get up. Others reported waking with their pajamas on backward or inside out, or naked with the night clothes they had worn to bed nowhere to be found, or their feet caked in mud. Drivers were confused to find themselves suddenly far from where they had been, way off the intended road, or much closer to their destination than they remembered.
One woman said, I don't know how to do this. She said, I'm a member of the PTA. I shop at Stop and Shop. How do I go back to my PTA now? And, so these people feel they are really trapped between two worlds. They're very normal. Once they've gone through this process, let's put it that way, they feel very conflicted. They're normal in so many ways, and yet they've had an experience that is so extraordinary. First of all, they can't tell anybody about it because they'll be laughed at. It's very troubling for these people. And as you cited in that excerpt from the article, people can't explain these things. They wake up with muddy feet. Now, do they sleepwalk at night? One of the cases I talk about in the book is two girls had a sleepover, two young girls. And during the night, the parents, where they were sleeping over, went down to check on them and found them gone. And they called the police. It was a big uproar. And they searched everywhere, couldn't find them. And then a few hours later, they turned up back in their beds. Mack took this as an anecdotal example of people actually physically absent during abduction, which is not always the case. Sometimes people might travel psychically, he thought, and be physically present and yet psychically absent. There was a case of that, a woman who collapsed in front of her husband, and he was holding her, and she later recounted traveling in an astral plane to some, spaceship, but he was with her the whole time. So it's both cases. But so these people are really caught in between. They have nowhere to turn, really, now that Mack's not around taking, being their champion. I don't know who they're going to. I don't know who's doing the research now, but I have to believe some of it is still going on. I don't know how prominent it is, but there are still some very unexplained things going on.
Clyde Haberman writes, don't we all have the experience of suddenly thinking of a person we hadn't thought of in many years, and then almost right away that person shows up or phones? Is there a reason to believe this is anything but curious but familiar coincidence?
Carl Jung said these synchronicities, you're reading a chapter in a book about something, you look out the window, you're reading about a red car, and you look out the window, well, that's pretty common, a red car, so that wouldn't be so striking. But very often things will come up once you've thought of them in one context, you'll suddenly see something that'll bring them up, or you'll think of somebody. Jung thought they were like cosmic wormholes. I don't think he ever used the word. Maybe wormholes weren't discovered yet, but secret connections, in the universe that are not explainable by mere coincidence or conventional means. So I think it's more than just coincidence.
You had to school yourself in psychiatry in order to write this book, did you not?
A little bit. I mean, there's a danger in turning yourself into an armchair psychiatrist, because you think that, well, I can analyze Mack now because I've looked at his stuff. So I try to stay humble and avoid that. I read a fair amount of his writings, and as I said, what came through so powerfully is that he was an expert in nightmares, for example. He wrote a whole book on nightmares. So you couldn't say to him, oh, you don't know, you don't understand. These people were just having a nightmare. Well, he knew nightmares. He knew childhood development. So he knew, how children think. He wrote a whole, book about it. So I sort of was looking over his shoulder, perhaps, and learned that way.
Ben Petrusky asks a related question to that. How would you describe Mack's contribution to science or understanding of the mind? What do you think his contributions were?
I put the word hard science in the subtitle, The Believer, Alien Encounters, Hard Science, and the Passion of John Mack, because I take science very seriously, and I wanted to subject his hypotheses to scientific examination, which critics have done and skeptics have done, so I think Mack did try to look for other explanations scientifically. He certainly participated in a lot of conferences where scientists were welcome and tried to, debunk his conclusions. And one by one, he would knock them down. He would say, no, it's not sleep apnea because they don't always happen during sleep. They're not cultural memes because children 2 years old haven't read, books, and they haven't gone to the movies, and they don't know anything except, their own little world. So one by one, so Mack, had a veneration for science, and I think I take account of that. And he wrote a book on suicide. A girl at a school his son was attending committed suicide at 14, a very touching story. And Mack looked through all her papers, and he didn't understand why the school missed all the warning signs that she was troubled. And she actually gave signals that she was considering suicide, and the school dismissed it. Anyway, he wrote a whole book about that. He had a solid scientific backing ground. He was not just going off, wildly grasping onto this theory. He really did take it seriously, and he knew what he was getting into. I mean, he knew the ridicule he would face. On the other hand, I don't want to paint him as some kind of god, who knew everything or was, supernaturally gifted or so. He was very human. He had this weakness for women. He was over enthusiastic. He was very naive. By the way, this audience of newspaper people will appreciate this. When he would sit for an interview, he would say the stupidest things. He would say, well, can I talk a little bit about astrology? Now, don't put this in. One of his questioners would say, can I ask you about drugs? And he would turn to his handler and say, I don't know, should we talk about drugs? And the handler would say, no. He placed a lot of faith, unwarranted faith in the interviewers that he sat with. And every now and then they stuck the shiv in.
Going back to my other question, or at the beginning here, do you think LSD had any effect on his mental capacity?
Not only LSD, he was kind of a devotee. I don't think he went off the deep end as a result, but he did. He wrote about it himself. It put him into states of ecstasy and despair. He actually tried ayahuasca too and got terribly sick, like everybody gets with ayahuasca. He had visions. So I don't think it destroyed his brain. Actually, as I say in the book, one of his confidants was Lester Grinspoon, who wrote the first book on marijuana. He just died recently, he had a big obit in the Times. Mack went to see him when he first heard about alien abduction, and he said, look, this is what I'm coming up with. And Grinspoon said, this is ridiculous. John, have you told anybody about this? Don't. He became a big proponent, Lester Grinspoon, of marijuana, way ahead of his time. And I think Mack was into it. He talked about doing drugs with Sally, and Sally was less into it than he was.
Sally was his wife. Did your research alter your belief or disbelief in God? You may or may not want to answer that. Alex Jones asks, would it be fair that this research changed your own view of what constitutes quote unquote reality?
Yes, it did. It did. I always felt I'm a spiritual person. I grew up with training in Judaism. I'm not traditionally religious. I don't observe all the holidays and don't go to temple all the time. But I do have a spiritual dimension, belief, and I'm much more aware from my reading now of anomalies and things that don't fit. I was just reading. I'm appearing tonight at a bookstore virtually a bookstore in LA with Dan Aykroyd. Aykroyd, is going to talk about his experience with Ghostbusters. So it turns out that Aykroyd's family has been always deeply into ghosts. His great grandfather participated in seances, and his father wrote a book, a very good book, which I just read, on ghosts. So, every time I read, more on the subject, I realize there are things we don't understand. And physics is now validating some of that to an extent that there are really spooky things in physics that no one understands. And I quote Dennis Overby in my epilogue of, some of the strange findings that they have in physics now, which, must make you think that there's something more there than we can perceive easily as the quote physical world.
Some of the audience wants to get down to brass tacks here. One, how well is the book selling? And two, have you been contacted yet by Netflix and Amazon?
From your mouth to God's ears. It's hard to tell about sales because the book just officially went on sale yesterday. But like every author, you track the Amazon rankings, and it seems to be moving in the right direction. So that's good.
Mack's own books, the Passport books, were bestsellers, right?
Yeah, he sold very well, and plus he had tremendous publicity because of who he was, including, by the way, the curtain raiser for his Abduction book was in the New York Times Magazine. They love to write about him at the Times, not always flatteringly, I must say. Yeah, I'm happy that things are going well. It's early on, and it's a tough world now with virtual this and virtual that. So
no movie contracts yet.
There's an option pending, so we'll have to see.
Is this Los Angeles appearance part of a larger book tour?
I published with the University of New Mexico Press, and they have been very good. First of all, New Mexico is a great place to publish a UFO alien-themed book because so much of what's going on has happened out there. Roswell happened there, and there've been a lot of sightings, and the West is where Area 51 is in Arizona, and anyway, a lot of weird stuff goes on in the desert. The more you read about this stuff, the weirder it gets.
David Margolick, you had a role in this. You want to unmute yourself and talk or ask a question?
I didn't really have a role in it, except that I tried to sort of mediate Ralph's difficulties with his first publisher, who was my publisher. And I think that it's probably best if Ralph tells that story and sort of enlarges it into how publishers have received this and how publishers have dealt with this topic.
Yeah, David was the shoulder I leaned on because he was privy to what was going on. Originally, I had publishing deal with a small commercial publisher who I thought was a supporter of my basic approach on John Mack, and I was well into it when I found out that she was a debunker, really didn't believe any of it, and wanted me to take a much more negative approach, which I couldn't do. The one good thing that came out of it, which David I think will appreciate, is that I became much more careful in my judgments as a result of trying to please her. She kept sending me back to anthropologists, thinking that an anthropologist would provide the answer to what this phenomenon was. And every time I talked to the anthropologists she suggested, they would agree that they didn't have the answer. It was, an interesting dimension, but there was no social explanation or cultural explanation for what had happened to these people. The interviews I conducted with anthropologists, some of which are in the book, made it a better book. So I must say, in a perverse kind of way, the Sturm und Drang that I went through with this, that David was well aware of, made it a better book because it put me on notice that I had to be a skeptic myself in the way I wrote it. So, because the worst thing would have been to come out as a partisan of John Mack and accept his material at face value and argue for him on his behalf. He did that himself in his two books. He didn't need me to, add a third book saying that he was right with his two books. So what I could contribute would be an independent look and say, well, here's where he was right, here's where he was wrong, here's the mistakes he made. So, and I think that turned out to be valuable. So I am grateful, really, I wasn't at the time, I was really pissed. I now look back and say I'm grateful for that episode, that struggle with the first publisher, because it put me in a much better position when I did get to write the book.
And it's being published by the University of New Mexico, which, given the whole Roswell story, is an interesting. Is that a coincidence?
Nothing is a coincidence.
There are no coincidences. So.
We're all living on tracks into the future.
Were they interested because of Roswell?
I think so. I think there is a lot of interest out there in alien phenomena and UFOs, because a lot of them have been tracked out there. And the virtues of going with a smaller publisher are that they pay more attention to you in your book. I've had a very good publicity team working with me. One guy is even in Spain with his own company on contract to the University of New Mexico Press. He's in my corner. I've got other people who are very eager to help. Maybe they don't get a university press doesn't always get provocative books like this, so they've jumped into it in a very proactive way, and booked me on a lot of podcasts and things like that. So I must say there is an advantage in going with a smaller press.
And someone asked, can we tune in to your interview in Los Angeles?
Yeah, I mean, they may cut it off after a point, but it's very easy. Go on to Skylight Books. They're in Los Angeles. They have a events page. If you go to the calendar, today's calendar, and click on it, I think it's called Crowdsource events. And right at the top in green letters, it says RSVP for tonight's event. It's 9:30 Eastern time, 6:30 Pacific time. At some point, they may cut it off. I did an event 2 nights ago at the Shakespeare and Company, a virtual event with the same thing, a webinar. And they cut it off after 120 people, to my disappointment. But I have the link now, so I'm going to put that up. But I did that with Leslie Kane, by the way, who was one of my collaborators on the Times UFO articles. And she's an expert herself. She wrote a very good book on UFOs, and she wrote the book that the 6-part Netflix series now on surviving death is based on. I would especially commend people to the first episode. It's about 2 doctors, women doctors who have had, who died and came back, you want to put it that way, who were pronounced brain dead and had an experience and then were brought back to life. Absolutely astounding stuff.
All right. Well, I think we've exhausted our time, and we haven't even talked about the rest of your career. What else are you working on? Are you working on non-alien abduction stuff?
Get a little plug for Baruch College. I'm working in the archives on a collection called it's the Institute of Public Administration collection, and we have a blog called An Adventure in Democracy. I'm very proud of An Adventure in Democracy. If you just Google that. And it talks about the career of Luther Gulick, who was a colleague, actually, of Robert Moses. You know, Robert Caro was just on the the CCNY talk show circuit. I watched him the other night talking about Robert Moses. And Luther Gulick went to school with Robert Moses, and they had a parting of the ways, as everyone will with Robert Moses. But Gulick was a great believer in good government and a theoretician of government management, a wonderful guy, advised Mayor Lindsay and Wagner and FDR. We have his collection, and I've done some lecturing on that and writing about that. But that is really a labor of love. You know, the whole field of public administration and government management. We abdicated that for 4 years recently, in case anyone noticed. But so I'm doing that, and I'm still looking for pieces for the Times. I still contribute to the paper, you know, as a freelance. They still, luckily, take my stories. So we'll see.
Alex Jones, by the way, left. He said, very interesting. Good luck. Best. Kate McLeod bought your book just now.
Not only Amazon, please, folks. There's bookstores, independent bookstores that would love to have the sales. And I autographed a bunch at Shakespeare and Company opposite Hunter College, Lexington 68. So if you're passing there, you can get an autographed copy and buy it right there. You know, everybody just automatically reaches for Amazon, and I'm grateful to them for being, you know, such an accessible bookseller. But it really is squeezing the independents. So any way you can support an independent bookstore, please.
The audience is silently applauding since they're all muted.
Thank you all.
Okay.